I met a traveler from an antique land who said, "Two vast and trunkless legs of stone stand in the desert. Near them on the sand, half sunk, a shattered visage lies, whose frown and wrinkled lip and sneer of cold command tell that its sculptor well those passions read, which yet survive, stamped on these lifeless things, the hand that mocked them, and the heart that fed." And on the pedestal these words appear: "My name is Ozymandias, King of Kings. Look on my works, ye mighty, and despair. Nothing beside remains. Round the decay of that colossal wreck, boundless and bare, the lone and level sands stretch far away."
No, Jack, no, God, Jack!
Do what you're gonna do.
He put a knife on my mom. He attacked her. He's dangerous. I think he might have killed somebody.
You're never gonna see Hank again. I've still got things left to do.
Are you tired of the same boring content from other YouTubers? Do you want to spice up your life with basically the same level of unoriginality, but this time with a different monotone male voice? Well, now you can. Consider subscribing. You'll get mediocre content, and the channel will get a variety of monetary benefits. Also, join the Discord server.
The episode begins with a fade into a close-up on a flask of liquid beginning to boil. This picture, in combination with the silence surrounding it, creates this eerie atmosphere, subtly giving the viewer a feeling of dread and despair. This beginning truly encapsulates the attitude of this episode, the essence of climax. In fact, a large portion of the scenery and prop design was designed to evoke emotion. Well, this is true among other shows, or even episodes of Breaking Bad. This episode uses this design in a miraculously skillful way. There's nothing quite like the design of this episode. The camera then pans over to Walt and Jesse inside the RV. If you remember, Walt had the RV destroyed near the end of the third season to avoid busting his operation. On top of this, Walt mysteriously has his hair back. So you see, now we know. The cure for male pattern baldness is one we never expected. Meth! This inclusion almost telepathically lets the viewer know that this event is taking place far, far earlier than the destruction of the RV. This scene comes to us as almost nostalgic, hinting at the tantalizing nature of the past and the regrets we have. Over the course of this introductory scene, we will see more and more hints as to exactly when this event takes place. Further on, we'll analyze what this scene does for the viewer and how it ties back to its original subject. All of this recognition happens in an instant, giving us the most understanding possible in the shortest amount of time, which is a very hard direction to take a scene in, so this was masterfully done, and it blends perfectly well with the rest of the episode. After, and possibly during, our comprehension of these details, Jesse asks if there is more to be done in the synthesization process. Walt tells him that there simply isn't anything else to be done other than waiting. Jesse, wondering how long that will take, gets a rather condescending response from Walt when he says,
Well, if we had a freezer, condensed liquid would cool more quickly because, of course, exothermic reaction.
Jesse interrupts, mumbling,
Our desired product is
Put me into a coma, why don't you?
Walt reacts to this as if Jesse was still his student, appalled by his disrespect.
What did you just say?
It's in these scenes of minute detail, this downtime, that this show strangely shines quite a bit. After everything we've seen happen with these two, everything that they've done to each other, it's kind of refreshing to see them back when they really didn't know anything, before they've been pushed to their brink. Narratively speaking, this creates a juxtaposition between the characters we knew and the characters that we now know. We've seen them mature in ways that we truly didn't expect. We've watched them grow. It's been 5 seasons, and we've quite literally seen these people contort into new, arguably worse versions of themselves. Jesse pulls out a pack of cigarettes, and Walt immediately tells him that he can't do it in the RV. Clearly, Walt feels that he is in power, tutoring an inexperienced, immature individual, much like the students he teaches now. Jesse responds with a sarcastic,
Duh, like I'm an idiot.
Yeah, like you're an idiot.
Dick.
Walt, reflecting on Jesse's disrespect, mulls on his response. You may recognize the next few scenes, and I'll clue you in on the details that you might have missed. Jesse and Walt walk outside, Jesse strongly reacting to Walt removing his apron, leaving him exclusively in underwear. It's here where the camera pans back, revealing a wide and showing to the viewer that there have yet to be any bullet holes in the RV. These bullet holes had been shot through near the end of the pilot episode, subtly cluing you in to the nature of this intro. On top of this, we get a wide shot of the environment they're in. It's almost entirely desert. It's evident to the discerning viewer that the desert is symbolic of a lot of things in this show, since it's such a prominent portion of it. Among these representations, the first and most prominent is isolation. The desert is regularly used as an escape, and sometimes ends well, and other times does not. For our purposes, isolation is the best use case, as it shows up throughout a large portion of this episode, representing both comfort and despair. Who knows? Maybe those sands contain other more carefully kept secrets. Wink wink nudge nudge. Following his exit from the RV, Walt dresses himself and prepares for the excuse he will have to offer to Skylar as an explanation for his absence later on that evening. He creates for himself a situation in which Bogdan, the proprietor of the car wash Walt worked at in the earlier seasons, needs him to stay back and provide assistance with receipts. This was among one of the first mistakes following his diagnosis. He has put himself in a position where he will distance himself from his family if there ever comes a time when his secret comes out. He wasn't thinking about the consequences at that time, as he believed that this would be his only cook, and that he wouldn't live long after that. This, if anything, tells us how broken Walter was, even in the beginning. As Walt gets on the phone, the scene cuts to Skylar boxing up a porcelain clown that Walt had previously purchased. They discuss the name of their coming child, when Skylar presents Holly as her preferred option. Walt doesn't initially favor this, but after they take an opportunity to talk about Walt being late that evening, and Skylar presenting the option for him to pick up pizza, he warms up to the name a bit, reflecting on a positive conversation. This tells us that Walt truly does love his family, and that he would do anything for them, even committing crimes. This familial affection has gotten Walt into trouble, and will continue to do so. Because of this, Walt truly believes that, with all this new money, he'll have more time to devote to his wife, his children, and most importantly, his life. Walt, at least at this point in time, is unhappy with his current situation. His family will soon run into financial trouble, and they've got a new kid on the way. On top of that, he's just received a cancer diagnosis telling him that he doesn't have long to live. He can't just leave his family with nothing but a meager life insurance policy. This is what's causing him to start his business. As I said earlier, he doesn't think this will last long, so he feels no sense of permanency. However, as he gets more chances at life, he goes back to that exhilarating feeling of doing something that is wrong. On top of that, he also begins to feel more powerful, just as we saw when he lets Walt Jr. drink himself to sickness at a family party in episode 10 of season 2. After receiving good news, he feels he can exert more power on his environment, and that becomes a driving force in his continuation of his business. He begins to rationalize his actions by believing himself so powerful. This is another bit of irony that ties the entire show back to the concept of Ozymandias. I swear I'll talk about this, but right now we should get back to the episode, to the present, so we can collect more connections between the Ozymandian Empire and the Heisenberg Empire. And so, the title card plays.
Good evening. This is Eve Henderson with Houston News Now. In a shocking turn of events, a U.S. military bomb has gone missing, and a bombing has occurred in the city of New York. According to military officials, the bomb, which is reportedly nuclear, was being transported from Kirtland underground munitions to a separate secure storage facility when it vanished without a trace. The military has launched a full investigation into the matter and is working closely with local and federal law enforcement agencies to locate the missing bomb. In the meantime, residents of New York are on edge after a bombing occurred in the downtown area earlier today. The blast, which occurred at approximately significant damage to a number of buildings, injured at least 300,000, and nearly 515,000 are dead. Authorities are currently investigating the bombing and are searching for those responsible. It is not yet clear if the missing military bomb is connected to the bombing in any way. The bomb's disappearance was recognized at 12:55 p.m. If they do turn out to be the same bomb, the question on everyone's mind will be how to New York in mere minutes. We will continue to follow this developing story and bring you updates as they become available. This is
Immediately, the sounds of gunshots ring out. The same shot of the desert coming back on screen, with Uncle Jack Welker's gang fading in behind their cars. We are back in modern day, 20 months after the events of the very first episode, and the intro of this episode. They cease their fire, and the camera slowly pans in on them, while they keep their guns locked on their target, wary of any form that may move. We cut to two cars, the one in the foreground absolutely bombarded with bullet holes. Behind it is Hank, his leg bleeding out after being shot in the prior episode, gazing at Gomez's lifeless body on the ground before him. At this moment, Hank knows that the only viable plan of action is to retrieve the shotgun Gomez had been using prior to his death. In an immense amount of pain, he pulls himself down to the ground, crawling over to the cadaver, Jack walking over and keeping his eyes on Hank. This shot serves to show the partition between good and evil. I'd say Breaking Bad tends to never deal in absolutes, only discussing matters in the in-between, on an infinite grayscale. In contrast, these two characters are prime examples of good and evil. Hank being the DEA agent out to bring order to the world, as a member of the forces fighting in the war on drugs, and Jack being an affront to order, a white supremacist agent of chaos. As soon as Hank reaches the weapon, Jack places his foot aggressively on it, halting him from picking it up off the ground. It's at this moment that we realize there's no hope for Hank. With no genuine weapon besides perhaps the words of Heisenberg, he's finished, knowing that the gang isn't contemplating his fate because, after all, their minds are made up already. Todd looks around the cars and realizes that neither of them know the location of Jesse Pinkman. While the others go searching for him, Kenny notices Gomez's badge, indicating that Hank's a DEA agent, warranting Jack to point his gun at Hank. Walt hears the loading of the gun and quickly shoots up from his position in the car, still tied up and covered in glass from all the numerous shots to the car, yelling and kicking for Hank not to be killed. All Hank can do at this moment is wait and stare with rage at Jack. Throughout this story, he's one of the only characters that remains unwavering. He'd been a good person all that time ago, and in between it got kind of questionable. But he is still a good person at this moment. He truly believed in the good of his family, and even when he let his wife shoplift, he did it because he felt he understood. He wasn't a paragon of ethics, but he always had conviction, his mind set on justice. Perhaps this is why this moment is so striking and so tragic. This is the moment when evil triumphs over good. These next moments show how just very different and similar Walt and Hank are at the same time. Jack expresses his frustration with how Walt never informed him that he had a DEA agent for a family member, a quintessential detail that breaks the foundation of their relationship. Walt tries to make it clear that it's only between the two of them, him and Hank, and that this shouldn't concern any members of the gang. Jack naturally asks if there are any cavalry coming, to which Walt replies there aren't. This is proven to be futile, though, when Hank immediately says, with absolute assurance, that they are.
I called you off.
Too late now.
Doesn't matter. It doesn't concern you.
Yeah, I'd say it does concern me.
This is between him and me.
No cavalry coming? Bet your ass the cavalry's coming.
No.
Throughout this show, we've seen the lives of these two people become even more intertwined beyond just a familial connection. Take their occupations at the beginning of the show, for example. Hank has a position of power and genuine respect, holding the role of DEA with passion and certainty. This can be opposed to Walt's job as a chemistry teacher. The first episode making it absolutely clear that he gets zero respect, because after all, it's high school. It's not a given that students will treat you as human, especially if you're working in a lower-end neighborhood. Regardless of this, these two share the same desire, that being to aid their families and protect them moving forward. This motive stands to explain why they put themselves in the positions they would find themselves in. The ones they find themselves in now. Hank, in his profession, wants to protect his family from every and all danger that may pose them, using his job as a means for doing so. As for Walt, the drug business is his vessel for financial stability and security, something he had before, albeit loosely and quite nearly, but honestly can now truly achieve. It's within these motives and actions that corruption can occur. They both grow increasingly violent as the story progresses, using their both knowledge of the drug trade and aptitude in chemistry, respectively. In essence, this reveals the absurdity of the human condition and how divergent we can become, even if our motives are the exact same. Walt tries his absolute hardest to prevent Hank from dying, even when Jack says it's unlikely that there will be any scenario where he lives. Jack holds his impulsivity for a moment here when Walt mentions that there's cash buried somewhere out here in the desert. $80 million, to be exact. He explains that this is life-changing money beyond any comprehension. Jack looks down, asking Hank directly if his life should be spared, addressing him as, quote-unquote, fed in the process. Walt interjects, saying that his name is Hank. Walt has a lot of respect for this man, despite his actions in the past, and it's shown on full display here. And then this happens.
You can have any future that you want, and all you've got to do is let him go.
What do you think, Fed? Would you take that deal?
His name is Hank.
How about it, Hank?
My name is Asac Schrader. You can go fuck yourself.
One of the most badass lines in the show, revealing that he is 100% prepared for his execution. Walt, on the other hand, is not. His body still restrained. He asks for Hank's attention, softly calling for him to look at him. Hank is still writhing on the ground, attempting to contain his pain from the bullet wound. Perhaps if Walt had begun his exchange as the legendary Heisenberg, rather than as Walter White, Hank may not have met his fate in such a way. What follows is the last interaction between these two behemoths of characters. Walt wants Hank to tell him that we can all work this out, wrongfully believing in this false narrative where everybody wins. That's what's been pushing him this entire time. A false reality where everybody wins and everything works out, much like a fairy tale. But this isn't a fairy tale. Hank asks if he wants him to beg. Hank has always been this character that's full of pride, wanting to make the world a better place, so it'd be incredibly out of character if he were to beg. Walt keeps his eyes locked on him, waiting for something to happen. These two shots going back between these two characters only have the subject contained within them, showing how pivotal this moment is. The background is barely in view, and what is left in the frame is blurred and essentially a singular color. The placement of these characters in this scene serve as a juxtaposition between their fates and the power that they have in this moment. Walt is shown significantly higher than Hank, even though all his actions to try and save him are futile. However, Walt is likely to be the one who will live past this moment. In essence, Hank is still standing tall, even if he is lying on the ground, unable to do anything about his fate. There's nothing to be done, and Hank immediately acknowledges that in his next line.
You want me to beg? You're the smartest guy I ever met. You're too stupid to see. Made up his mind 10 minutes ago.
This is one of the most heartbreaking lines in this show. I think Walt knew unconsciously that this was the case, but didn't want to believe it, hoping that if he pushed hard enough, things could potentially change. Hank cocks his head to face Jack, bobbing back and forth, telling him to do what he's going to do when he's abruptly shot in the head.
Do what you're gonna do.
The camera moves back, the audience only being able to see Hank's head drop before the scene switches to a shot of mountainous terrain. The camera zooms in on Walt, all noise void throughout as he collapses to the ground, tears rolling down his face at the thought that he couldn't have prevented the inevitable. He, in this moment, has given up on any semblance of hope, his body slamming to the floor before allowing his head to gradually hit after. Using the coordinates Jack has written on his hand, he asks Kenny to whip out his phone and find where the money is buried. Walt's crying subtly heard in the background. As they search for them, you can just barely see Walt in the background, still lying on the floor, contemplating both his and Hank's mortality. Once the gang finds the coordinates, Jack orders Kenny to dig, to which he immediately finds the barrel filled with cash. Naturally, right after they open it, the entirety of the gang is ecstatic. I mean, who wouldn't be after finding a vat of $80 million? They continue digging when the shot switches to one of a mountain getting progressively darker, the clouds moving suspiciously quickly in the background, indicating that there's been a minor time jump to later that day. Todd, knowing that Hank's death was an unjust one, softens for a moment and requests that Jack give up a barrel for Walt. While the others object to this, Jack's respect for Todd and for Walt makes him leave behind a single barrel. Perhaps there is a bit of sentimentality in Jack after all. While this is occurring, Walt notices Jesse lying underneath a nearby car, so this is where he went to hide. As Jack's decision comes to a close, Walt gets up and silently, begrudgingly, accepts Jack's welfare. Jack expresses his remorse at not being able to find Jesse. However, Walt responds to this with a simple,
Pinkman, you still owe me.
If you can find him, we'll kill him.
Jack's gang dragged Jesse out from underneath the car, with him literally kicking and screaming. When Jesse is presented to Walt, Walt greets him with a stone-cold gaze, one with no remorse and no feeling, a signature look of superiority. Jack asks that Walt decides Jesse's fate, and after a few calculating moments, nods his head in affirmation. Todd interjects, requesting that Jesse be questioned before his execution so that they would know everything he told the DEA.
I watched Jane die. I was there. And I watched her die. I could have saved her, but I didn't.
Jack's gang leaves, burying Hank and Gomez, and leaving Walt with nothing but money and a way out. So Walt takes the car he was left with out onto the road, perhaps thinking about what happened, perhaps what he will do now, and makes it out quite a ways until the car runs out of gas. Walt leaves the car and checks the tank, realizing that the car was caught in the earlier crossfire. Leaving the car behind, he takes the barrel with him. This is one of the most human characterizations we've seen given to Walt, at least in the later seasons. Mankind has a tendency to double down, taking everything they can and sticking with it, even if it hurts them, and so he rolls his burden through the desert until he comes across a homestead, a legitimate homestead in the 21st century, and purchases a truck off its resident. The scene at last cuts to Skylar, who we can assume is calling Walt. Marie arrives and requests to speak with Skylar in her office. We know what Marie is going to tell Skylar, and when the scene of them in the office begins, we sit silently, the silence permeating the air, the suspense and dread lying over the scene like a heavy woolen blanket. And then Marie begins, cutting through that silence and dread like a scythe through wheat, with a firm, deadly thin edge. If you were as immersed as I was, you were nearly knocked back by the outburst of noise through that silence. The tenseness within me reacted like a spring, bringing me back to reality after the contemplation of the last few moments. Marie tells Skylar that Hank has arrested Walt, and that everything, their entire empire, is coming to an end. There is a measure of brutality in Marie's tone as she communicates this, but softens as she tells Skylar that she almost didn't come. She said she had to remind herself that Skylar was her sister, and that perhaps Skylar wasn't as involved as she had believed, citing Skylar pushing Walt out of her life for a time as her reasoning. She tells Skylar that Hank and her can help, as long as she gives up the recordings of Hank's transgressions. Skylar accepts this ultimatum, and Marie tells her that she must tell Walt Jr. Before we get to that, though, we are met with the second and final appearance of Jesse in this episode. Battered and beaten, Todd opens the door, and Jesse immediately begins to tell him everything he knows. Todd, almost saddened to see this, picks Jesse up and takes him in a hangar. He is secured to a chain that is connected to a linear rail. Jesse spots something on the wall further down and comes to learn that this is a picture of Brock Cantillo. Todd orders him to start cooking, and the scene closes. We see Marie, Skylar, and Walt Jr. in Skylar's office after she tells Walt Jr. about Walt's drug empire. This scene is heartbreaking in a way that few others in this show have been. There's something about Walt Jr.'s refusal to believe that Walter could do anything wrong. There's this clear bond between them, and it is so powerful that Walt Jr. simply refuses to believe anything Skylar says, saying that if she wasn't lying then, she's lying now, and if not, then vice versa, implying that there would be no reason to believe anything that she tells him, since, she lied. Skylar and Walt Jr. return home in silence. They notice Walt's beaten truck, not knowing who it may be. They enter the house warily, only to find Walt packing their bags. Skylar and Walt Jr. are confused, as Skylar believed Walt was in jail. Walt Jr. confused at Walt's frantic nature. Things quickly devolve, as Walt reveals, albeit implicitly, that all of Walt Jr.'s worries are true.
Just listen to me! Go. Now, both of you, go.
Why are you here?
Right now, this is our priority.
Where is he? Where's Hank?
I negotiated.
Negotiated?
Yes.
Why do we need to leave?
Where is Hank. You killed Hank.
No, no, no! I tried to save him! Everything's gonna be okay.
Walt tries to force them to leave, but is forced back by Skylar wielding a knife. Suspecting that Walt killed Hank, he is cut and fights her for the knife, driving them to the floor. Walt eventually wrestles the knife away and is tackled by Walt Jr. This scene is also a bit heartbreaking, as this is when Walt Jr. denies the existence of his father, telling Walt that he can never be Walt Jr.'s father.
Get out of here. Get out!
Stop it! Do that! Stop!
What the hell is wrong with you? We're a family!
Walt then picks up Holly and leaves, backing into Skylar's car and departing.
Wait, nigga, a royal link. Oh my god. Please! Please!
I can say for certain that no other series was able to maintain this reputation in its most desperate and critical times. I'm looking at you, Game of Thrones. Walt leaves and brings Holly to a restroom somewhere where he changes her diaper. Walt seems genuinely happy in this moment, which gives the viewer some short reprieve from the chaos of the last half hour. However, Holly begins to cry, calling out for her mom. This visibly affects Walt, sending pangs of emotion through him and through us. He gives Holly a gentle hug and smiles a long, sad smile. The scene returns to Skylar in their house with members of the police. The police send out an Amber Alert, complete with every detail about Walt, Marie, Skylar, and Walt Jr. The remaining members of Walt's family left, besides Holly. Walt calls Skylar, and Skylar is told to pick up the phone so they can trace his phone and record the contents of the phone call. Walt begins to berate Skylar for not being involved in his trade, absolving her and the rest of his family of any wrongdoing. This comes across as harsh at first, but we soon get to see Walt's face as he begins to cry, mourning the loss of his family, that connection he once had. He hangs up, leaving Skylar, Marie, and Walt Jr. to live their lives in peace. As soon as he hangs up, he brings Holly to the fire station and places her in the truck with the address of their house on a sticky note attached to her chest, turning the lights on so the people in the station would scout the area and find her. After this, we see Walt drive off into the darkness, away from his family and his broken empire, to conclude his story. Now we are at the end, the part you've all been waiting for, no doubt. I previously alluded to the connection between Ozymandias, the figure and the poem, to Heisenberg and his character arc. But first we must discuss some background information. The poem was read at the beginning of this video in a word-for-word recreation of Ozymandias by Percy Bysshe Shelley, an English poet who was inspired by a torso and head statue that would be making its way to a nearby museum. The statue was that of Ramses II, who was also known as Ozymandias. Shelley saw what was left of the statue as being symbolic of Ramses' reign. There's the foundation, those legs that still stand, and the ruler, the bust that fell. He uses the statue as a metaphor for human futility, expressing the deep and depressing reality that, while we may exert change during our time, the sands of time will slowly erode at the memory of us and our change. The world will be permanently affected by that change, and it will be written over so many times that it will be essentially forgotten, like a sand dune forming over some forgotten monument. Essentially, I'd like to compare Walt's character arc to that of Ozymandias. He has a great rise and fall, first as Walter White, a family man, and then as Heisenberg, the drug lord. This is almost nearly what happens to Ozymandias, or as he is formerly known, Ramses II. He rose as the man, Ramses II, then became a nearly godlike being in Ozymandias. However, all things must come to an end, and Ozymandias' reign is no different. And frankly, neither is Walt's. This episode, in short, is expressing the end of an empire. We see the beginning of this end when Hank is killed. There are two pillars, the legs upon which the statue once stood, that remain, a foundation that leaves a legacy, much like the legacy Walt will leave behind, both for his children, his wife, and for the world. The fallen torso and head, signifying the leader, the forefront of the empire, falling, perishing, and being forgotten. This is accentuated by the framing of the scene in which Walt falls, and the only sections of his body that remain in frame are his torso and head. This is another death for him, one that he cannot rationalize or forget. Another wearing of the legs above the sand. Furthermore, when he returns home to bring his family with him and they subsequently deny him, it represents an additional debilitation of his authority and power, as the sands of time and civilization wear at him and his entire being, returning everything to the ashes from which they came. When he takes Holly, it's a desperate play at power for a man who will lose everything. Indeed, everything will be lost to him. But only to him. In his last moments of connection to his family, he absolves them of all wrongdoing, placing any and all responsibility on himself. He makes his final decisions, hoping that his family will be able to prosper when he is gone, returning to that goal he made at the very beginning when he knew he was going to die. In truth, Ozymandias, the poem, the episode, and the symbolic figure are representations of cycles. It is in this episode that the greater cycle is ended, and all that's left is the falling action. Walt has condemned himself, and for the good of his family. They say that selflessness precedes a knowing death, and for Walt, this is his final death. His first death came in learning that he had cancer, his second in his first cook, third in becoming Heisenberg, fourth in killing, fifth in Hank's death, and at last when he let his family go. He's left to complete his work, almost aimlessly, filling the time before his body dies with what he knows best. Chemistry. His cycle of death and rebirth have given him a new purpose and new regrets. In his final rebirth, his regrets were cleansed. He's now the agent that controls the story, as he is no longer controlled by it. For the last 2 episodes, he will simply finish what needs to be done, as the man holding the reins of the falling action. His falling action. There's a level of inspiration in Walt's realization that he is simply another grain in the sands of time. Maybe a sad ending, but it is not a bad ending. There's a perfect line that a writer must balance on when doing this, and this ending sits harmoniously in the exact middle. We may mourn Walt's death, but we also celebrate the life he had, the life he lived, and what he left behind. He set out to complete a goal, give his family a stable future, and he did that. In the end, we should be happy for Walt, as he has completed his life, his cycle of power, from Walt to Heisenberg, and then to Walt again. And because it was done so well, I'm inclined to feel happy. This is the best ending for Walt, in all honesty. In no other way could he have completed his goals and died a happy man. For us, we are left to feel happy that we had this time with Walt. All things must come to an end, and we have actually accepted it. And that is why this is the best episode in television history. Thank you.
Don't you ever talk about me, or you gotta get yourself up. Wake up in the morning, have a second, going off first.